In the long line of kings and queens to reign over England, a few have caused division, but perhaps one king stands above all others for his strong belief that a king had a divine right to rule as an absolute monarchy. This is the history of Charles I. Charles was born in Dunfermline Palace, Fife, on the 19th of November 1600, the second son of King James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark. James VI was the first cousin twice removed of Queen Elizabeth I of England, and when she died childless in March 1603, he became King of England as James I. Charles was a weak and sickly infant, and while his parents and older siblings left for England in April and early June that year, due to his fragile health, possibly caused by rickets, he remained in Scotland with his father's friend, Lord Fife, appointed as his guardian until he was 3.5, when it was decided that he was strong enough to journey to England to be reunited with his family. In mid-July 1604, he left Dunfermline for England, where he was to spend most of the rest of his life. In January 1605, Charles was created Duke of York, as is customary in the case of the English sovereign's second son, and made a Knight of the Bath. Despite being hindered from his physical deformities, Charles became a skilled horseman and marksman and took up fencing. Even so, his public profile remained low in contrast to that of his physically stronger and taller elder brother, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, whom Charles adored and attempted to emulate. But in early November 1612, Charles's brother Henry died at the age of 18 of what is suspected to have been typhoid, and Charles became heir apparent. As the eldest surviving son, he automatically gained several titles, including Duke of Cornwall and Duke of Rothesay, and in November 1616 he was created Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester. In 1618, the Bohemians rebelled against their Catholic governors, and in August 1619 the Bohemian Diet chose Frederick V, Elector Palatine, Charles's brother-in-law, who led the Protestant Union as their monarch. This rebellion quickly escalated into the 30 Years' War. The conflict, originally confined to Bohemia, spiralled into a wider European war, which the English Parliament and public quickly grew to see as a divided continental struggle between Catholics and Protestants. In 1620, King Frederick was defeated at the Battle of White Mountain near Prague, and his hereditary lands in the Electoral Palatinate were invaded by a Habsburg force from the Spanish Netherlands. James I, however, had been seeking marriage between Prince Charles and Ferdinand of Spain's niece, Maria Anna of Spain, and began to see the Spanish match as a possible diplomatic means of achieving peace in Europe. Unfortunately for James, negotiation with Spain proved unpopular with both the public and James's court. The English Parliament was actively hostile towards Spain and Catholicism, and thus, when called by James in 1621, the members hoped for an enforcement of resuscency laws, a naval campaign against Spain, and a Protestant marriage for the Prince of Wales. James I died on the 27th of March 1625, leaving Charles with a discontent parliament. 2 years after the breakdown of negotiations with Spain, Charles instead married the Bourbon princess Henrietta Maria of France. The couple were married on the 1st of May 1625 in front of the doors of Notre Dame de Paris. Charles was not present for the marriage and was married by proxy. They met in person on the 13th of June 1625 in Canterbury. Charles delayed the opening of his first parliament until after the marriage was consummated, to forestall any opposition. Many members of the Commons opposed Charles's marriage to a Catholic, fearing that he would lift restrictions on Catholics and undermine the official establishment of the Reformed Church of England. However, Charles told Parliament that he would not relax religious restrictions, but promised to do exactly that in a secret marriage treaty with his brother-in-law, Louis XIII of France. Charles was formally crowned king on the 2nd of February 1626 at Westminster Abbey, but without his wife at his side, because she refused to participate in a Protestant religious ceremony. Distrust in Charles's religious policies and requests for money grew into outcry with Parliament. Rather than a direct involvement in the European land war, the English Parliament preferred a relatively inexpensive naval attack on Spanish colonies in the New World, hoping for the capture of the Spanish treasure fleets. Parliament voted to grant a subsidy of £140,000, an insufficient sum for Charles's war plans. Also, the House of Commons limited his authorisation for the royal collection of tonnage and poundage, two varieties of custom duties, 2 a year, although previous sovereigns, since Henry VI, had been granted the right for life. In this manner, Parliament could delay approval of the rates until after a full-scale review of customs revenue. The bill made no progress in the House of Lords past its first reading. Although no parliamentary act for the levy of tonnage and poundage was obtained, Charles continued to collect the duties. To further the growing divide with Parliament was the disastrous naval expedition against Spain under Charles's favourite, the Duke of Buckingham's leadership. The House of Commons began proceedings for the impeachment of the Duke. In May 1626, Charles nominated Buckingham as Chancellor of Cambridge University in a show of support, and had 2 members who had spoken against Buckingham arrested at the doors of the House of Parliament. On the 12th of June 1626, the Commons launched a direct protestation against Buckingham, stating, "We protest before your Majesty and the whole world that until this great person be removed from the intermeddling with the great affairs of state, we are out of hope of any good success, and do fear that any money we shall or can give will through misemployment be turned rather to the hurt of this your kingdom than otherwise, as by lamentable experience we have found those large supplies formerly and lately given." Despite the protest, Charles refused to dismiss his friends, dismissing Parliament instead. Charles provoked further unrest by trying to raise money for the war through a forced loan, a tax levied without parliamentary consent. In November 1627, the test case of the King's Bench, the 5 Knights case, found that the King had a prerogative right to imprison without trial those who refused to pay the forced loan. Summoned again in March 1628, Parliament adopted a Petition of Rights on the 26th of May, calling upon Charles to acknowledge that he could not levy taxes without Parliament's consent, impose martial law on citizens, and imprison them without due process or quarter troops in their homes. Charles assented to the petition on the 7th of June, but by the end of the month he had prorogued Parliament and reasserted his right to collect custom duties without authorisation from Parliament. On the 23rd of August 1628, Buckingham was assassinated, and his death effectively ended the war with Spain and eliminated his leadership as an issue, but it did not end the conflicts between Charles and Parliament. In January 1629, Charles opened the second session of the English Parliament, which had been prorogued in June 1628, with a moderate speech on the tonnage and poundage issue. Members of the House of Commons began to voice opposition to Charles's policies in light of the case of John Wrong, a member of Parliament whose goods had been confiscated for failing to pay tonnage and poundage. Many MPs viewed the imposition of the tax as a breach of the Petition of Rights. When Charles ordered a parliamentary adjournment on the 2nd of March, members held the Speaker, Sir John Finch, down in his chair so that the session could be prolonged long enough for resolutions against Catholicism and tonnage and poundage to be read out and acclaimed by the Chamber. The provocation was too much for Charles, who dissolved Parliament and had 9 parliamentary leaders imprisoned over the matter. The next 11 years, during which Charles ruled England without a Parliament, are known as the Personal Rule, or the 11 Years' Tyranny. Ruling without Parliament was not exceptional, and was supported by precedent. But only Parliament could legally raise taxes, and without it, Charles's capacity to acquire funds for his treasury was limited to his customary rights and prerogatives. The chief tax Charles imposed was a feudal levy known as ship money, which proved even more unpopular and lucrative than tonnage and poundage before it. Previously, collection of ship money had been authorised only during wars and only on coastal regions, but Charles argued that there was no legal bar to collecting the tax for defence during peacetime and throughout the whole of the kingdom. Charles's religious policies caused further discontent, as he attempted to force the Church of Scotland to adopt the High Anglican practices, which led to the bishop wars, and waging war cost money. Charles needed Parliament. But Charles did not seek subsidies from the English Parliament to wage war, instead raising an army without parliamentary aid and marching to Berwick-upon-Tweed on the Scottish border. The army did not engage the Covenanters, as the king feared the defeat of his forces, whom he believed to be significantly outnumbered by the Scots. In the Treaty of Berwick, Charles regained custody of his Scottish fortresses and secured the dissolution of the Covenanters' interim government, albeit at the decisive concession that both the Scottish Parliament and General Assembly of the Scottish Church were called. The military failure in the First Bishops' War caused a financial and diplomatic crisis for Charles. He continued peace negotiations with the Scots in a bid to gain time before launching a new military campaign. Because of his financial weakness, he was forced to call Parliament into session in an attempt to raise funds for such an endeavour. Both the English and Irish Parliaments were summoned in the early months of 1640. In March, the Irish Parliament duly voted a subsidy of £180,000, with the promise to raise an army of 9,000 strong by the end of May. But in the English general election in March, court candidates fared badly, and Charles's dealings with the English Parliament in April quickly reached stalemate. The Earls of Northumberland and Stafford attempted to broker a compromise, whereby the king would agree to forfeit ship money in exchange for £650,000. Nevertheless, this alone was insufficient to produce consensus in the Commons. The parliamentarians' calls for further reforms were ignored by Charles, who still retained the support of the House of Lords. Despite the protests of the Earl of Northumberland, the short Parliament, as it became known, was dissolved in May 1640, less than a month after it assembled. As demands for a Parliament grew, Charles took the unusual step of summoning a great council of peers. By the time it met on the 24th September at York, Charles had resolved to follow the almost universal advice to call a Parliament. After informing the peers that a Parliament would convene in November, he asked them to consider how he could acquire funds to maintain his army against the Scots in the meantime. They recommended making peace. The long Parliament proved just as difficult for Charles as had the short Parliament. It assembled on the 3rd of November 1640 and quickly began proceedings to impeach the king's leading councillors for high treason. To prevent the king from dissolving it at will, Parliament passed the Triennial Act, which required Parliament to be summoned at least every 3 years and permitted the Lord Keeper and 12 peers to summon Parliament if the king failed to do so. The Act was coupled with the Subsidy Bill, and to secure the latter, Charles grudgingly granted royal assent in February 1641. Deepening mistrust coincided with a rebellion in Ireland and an invasion from a Scottish army, which led to civil war. In mid-1642, both Charles and Parliament began to muster their forces. Charles raised an army using the medieval method of commission of array, and Parliament called for volunteers for its militia. The negotiations to avoid conflict proved futile, and Charles raised his royal standard in Nottingham on the 22nd of August 1642. What followed was years of bloody warfare which divided the nations of England, Scotland and Ireland, splitting loyalty between family and friends. Charles fought the armies of the English and Scottish parliaments in the English Civil War. After his defeat in 1645 at the hands of the parliamentarian New Model Army, he fled north from his base at Oxford. Charles surrendered to a Scottish force, and after lengthy negotiations between the English and Scottish parliaments, he was handed over to the Long Parliament in London. Charles refused to accept his captors' demands for a constitutional monarchy and temporarily escaped captivity in November 1647. Re-imprisoned on the Isle of Wight, he forged an alliance with Scotland, but by the end of 1648, the new model army had consolidated its control over England. In January 1649, the Rump House of Commons indicted Charles for treason, though the House of Lords rejected the charge. The Rump Commons declared itself capable of legislating alone, and passed a bill creating a separate court for Charles's trial, and declared the bill an act without need for royal assent. Charles was accused of treason against England by using his power to pursue his personal interest rather than the good of the country. Over the first 3 days of the trial, whenever Charles was asked to plead, he refused, stating his objection with the words, "I would know by what power I am called hither, by what lawful authority." He claimed that no court had jurisdiction over a monarch, and that his own authority to rule had been given him by God and by the traditional laws of England, and that the power wielded by those trying him was only that of force of arms. Charles insisted that the trial was illegal. At the end of the 3rd day, Charles was removed from court, which then heard over 30 witnesses against him in his absence over the next 2 days, and on the 26th of January condemned him to death. The next day, the king was brought before the public session of the commission, declared guilty and sentenced. 59 of the commissioners signed Charles's death warrant. Charles's execution was scheduled for Tuesday, 30th of January 1649, and on the morning he called for 2 shirts to prevent the cold weather causing any noticeable shivers that the crowd could have mistaken for fear. He walked under guard from St James's Palace, where he had been confined, to the Palace of Whitehall, where an execution scaffold had been erected in front of the banqueting house. Charles addressed the crowd, stating, "I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." At about 2 p.m, Charles put his head on the block after saying a prayer and signalled to the executioner when he was ready by stretching out his hands. He was then beheaded in one clean stroke. It was common practice for the severed head of a traitor to be held up and exhibited to the crowd with the words, "Behold the head of a traitor." Charles's head was exhibited, but these words were not used, possibly because the executioner did not want his voice recognised. On the day after the execution, the king's head was sewn back onto his body, which was then embalmed and placed in a lead coffin. The commission refused to allow Charles's burial at Westminster Abbey, so his body was conveyed to Windsor on the night of 7th of February. He was buried in private on the 9th of February 1649 in the Henry VIII vault, alongside the coffins of Henry VIII and Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, in St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle.